Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Elizabeth. Tchaikovsky wrote, "This opera will sooner enjoy great success in homes than on the grand stage. The public will come to love it, and then the theatre will stage the opera in order to satisfy public demand." So here we are in a home, probably not unlike the home that the Larin family lived in. These are obviously distressing times, even at a remove, not least for those artists and team members whose families are caught up in the conflict in Ukraine, and for our friends at Pushkin House, a cultural institution with a long and proud history of dissent. We collected money for British-Ukrainian aid last week, gathering singers and supporters together to sing the Ukrainian national anthem by the statue of Saint Volodymyr in Holland Park Avenue. But we are very much going ahead with this summer's production of Eugene Onegin. We have waited 2 years to do this, and as our CEO and director of opera, James Clutton, has said, Puccini and Tchaikovsky are like Shakespeare, Beethoven or Michelangelo. They belong to the world. So, let me introduce tonight's panel. Cultural historian Rosamund Bartlett is the author of Tolstoy, A Russian Life, Chekhov, Scenes from a Life, and Wagner and Russia. She has also translated Anna Karenina for the Oxford World Classics series. Lada Valešová is a collaborative and solo pianist, coach, music director, and conductor. Back in 2020, when the three of us were in this room, probably with quite a few of you, Lada was going to be the young artists conductor of Onegin, but now she is the full deal. She is maestra. So we will begin this evening by tuning our ears to Tchaikovsky's sound world and then to Pushkin's sound world. Lada, would you play for us?
I will play a piece called The Autumn Song. Title is October. It's from Tchaikovsky's The Seasons cycle, which depicts every month of the year. And it gives a feeling of this eternal Russian soul melancholy. It's not very cheerful, but
Thank you very much, Lada. Rosamund, you've chosen a stanza from slightly later in the year than October.
I have. We're going to be going from elegiac autumn to a Russian winter's day. And in fact, the Russians have a very long winter, but Tatiana Larina, the heroine of this wonderful novel, loves winter. And the wonderful thing about Pushkin is that he writes in this very, very simple Russian. And I'm going to read to you the translation by Charles Johnston, because he has reproduced the particular rhyming scheme. There's a so-called Onegin stanza of 14 lines with a very particular rhyming scheme. And no, you cannot translate Pushkin. You probably cannot translate any literature well. I should know, having translated so many pages of Russian literature myself, but you can approximate the sort of music of it. And I like to think of Pushkin in a little bit like Mozart. There's something just so extraordinarily simple. How would you convey that simplicity? So this is from chapter 5. We're right in the middle, so it's at Christmas time, in fact. And this is how it goes, just these 14 lines, and then I'll read them in Russian too. Tanya, profoundly Russian being, herself not knowing how or why, in Russian winters thrilled at seeing the cold perfection of the sky, hoar frost and sun in freezing weather, sledges and tardy dawns together, with the pink glow the snows assume, and festal evenings in the gloom. The Larins kept the old tradition. Maidservants from the whole estate would on those evenings guess the fate of the two girls. Their premonition pointed each year for time to come at soldier husbands and the drum. So that gets right to the heart of the main theme of this novel too, because it's all about love and unrequited love and marriage and what love is. And at Christmas, the Russians have these traditions of fortune telling. And in the old times, of course, it was always the girls doing it. And they'd always have to do it sort of between midnight and 3 a.m. in the bathhouse. And they wanted to know who they were going to get married to. And of course, there wasn't very much freedom for anyone getting married in Russia in the old days. Anyway, let's just listen to how that sounds in Russian. And a Russian person would do this better than me. I'm only English, I'm afraid. Tatiana, русская душою, сама не зная почему, с ее холодной красою любила русскую зиму. На солнце иный, и день морозный, и санный, и зарею поздной, сияние розовых снегов, и мглу крещенских вечеров. По старине торжествовали в их доме эти вечера. Служанки со всего двора про барышень своих гадали, и им судили каждый год мужев военных их поход.
Beautiful, thank you. It is the most extraordinarily musical language. You said about the difficulty of trying to capture the music when you translate it into English. Are there words and phrases for which there is no adequate English equivalent?
There are many. I mean, the whole concept of the ruskaya dusha, the Russian soul, too, conveys a lot more. And generally speaking, one word in Russian has about 10 different translations in English, and you have to know what is being conveyed. But it is that musicality, actually, which is the one thing that one can have some success in as a translator. If you can try and listen for the rhythms and then try and convey the way the phrases shape in Russian. But there are many words. How do you translate dacha, for example, the country cottage that Russians go to? And in a way, the Larins are sort of living at their dacha all the year round, aren't they? Because they're on a country estate in the middle of provincial Russia, millions of miles away from a city.
That actually brings me to a question I was going to ask much later on. Are all Russian dramas basically based around the idea that you're in the countryside and you wish to be in the city, or you're in the city and you're bored of the city and you wish to be in the countryside?
Probably yes, I think so. I mean, if we think about the Larins, yes, they're longing for excitement, aren't they? And actually, the Russian way of life in the old days, and still today, actually, is you're in the city until the summer months, and then you go to your dacha in the countryside, and you're there long enough that you're sort of longing to go back to the city. So there is that tension between the two, and of course they are very different ways of life, because you're going from this sort of social whirl in the city to a very, very simple life in the countryside where you're, tilling your vegetable plot often. That's still something that goes on today.
This is, we believe, the only opera that begins with people making jam. It is based on a book or a novel in verse, which Pushkin said was about a normal Russian family. Rosamund, can you tell us what he meant by a normal Russian family?
Yeah. So this is really a novel about a certain class, the class of Pushkin himself, of course, and this is a quite autobiographical novel written in the 1820s and early 1830s. And Pushkin is writing about the noble class, and we're not talking about the high aristocracy here. We're not talking about royal people. The nobility is a social class that was really everyone who was educated, and it extended from people who were princesses and princes to people like the Larins. Mrs. Larin's a widow, so she doesn't have very much money, but they're still of this class, and they're not serfs, and everything was very segregated. So the Russian literary critic Belinsky said, Eugene Onegin, to give the novel its Russian title, is an encyclopedia of Russian life. And it does cover an enormous spectrum of shades of Russian life. But many people later on think, well, actually, there's only a certain section of Russian society that's focused on. And you have a few references to the serfs, but they don't really figure very much either in the novel or in the opera, do they?
Well, actually, I want to speak up in defence of Filipievna here, the nurse, because I think that she and her and Madame Larina essentially give us the setup for the predicament or the story of the two sisters, Tatiana and Olga. I mean, it's all about their marriageability, and the first thing that we hear, it's something like the old translation, the old sung translation was "God sends us habit from above."
Привычка свыше нам дана, замена счастью она. And what is really sweet is the little tune after if I can just demonstrate, it's not a bit I prepared, but the girls are singing the song by Alyabiev about the singer, and after we had the introduction, which introduces the character, I think, of Tanya. That's her theme, but what Rosamund mentioned, the dacha and the long days when girls are singing, another iconic opening. And so this flowing melody, and they sing the art song, the Larina and Nelly interject, but then we get suddenly this amazing vaudeville. So we see that they also probably see the humorous side to all of it and remember their adventures in St. Petersburg and with various counts and countesses, and yes, the habit brings us comfort at the end.
I have to say, I was feeling a bit of a Fiddler in the Roof moment there, just on
because there isn't actually very much humour in. I mean, it's very nice you mentioned. There's a little bit,
yes.
But one of the big differences between the novel and the opera is that we've got with the opera sort of full-blooded romantic opera in many ways, whereas Pushkin's a kind of proto-postmodernist. He's sort of a little bit like Lawrence Sterne with Tristram Shandy. He sort of figures in his own novel, and he's got a very ironic relationship with his characters. He doesn't take them that seriously all the time. Sometimes he's quite fond of them, and then sometimes he's rather sort of dismissive. And he's always going off on digressions, and there's an awful lot of parody of characters. So the character of Onegin is a parody of a sort of Byronic hero, and there's quite a lot of Pushkin himself in there too. But the humour, of course, quite often gets lost. So it's very nice that you've mentioned that there are a few touches here and there.
There are, yes. I think it's important probably to highlight them, you know. And I think when we spoke about the peasants and the various classes, I mean, their presence right at the beginning, scene 2, we have the chorus of peasants bringing in the harvest. And I think that explains to us as well, shows, because they call Larina Zdravstvuj Matushka Barinya, our mother, the provider who feeds us and looked after us. There was, serfs really looked up as unfair as we might see that system, but those were, you know, they call them Matushka and Batyushka, so like people who look after them, you know. So it's the peasants are present very strongly, and then we go, you know, maybe we'll talk about this later, about the various dances. I think that presents.
But they're very fond of Mrs. Larin because she's a woman and she's nice to them, which is probably
she's not a tyrant, is she?
And her late husband is widely lamented, unlike Onegin's uncle or father, who is the terrible miser.
That I will not speak of.
It's the uncle, I think, yeah. The one who dies.
Uncle was boring, and Onegin shocks Tatiana by saying, "Oh, I sat by his bed," and there's absolute agony, you know. But he was a good man, and may he be long blessed.
One of the phrases that often comes up when people talk about Onegin himself, the character, is this phrase, the superfluous man. Could you tell us a little bit about what the superfluous man is?
Yeah, it's a sort of real trope of Russian literature of the 19th century, the Russian novel in particular. And when I was an undergrad in the 1980s doing my Russian degree, we always had to write essays about the lishny человек, the superfluous man. So this is the first example, Onegin, of a superfluous man. And it's very specific to Russia. There's a little sort of bit of Byronic ennui and spleen and all of that stuff that comes from Europe. But what happens in Russia is that you've got heroes who can't be heroes because of the times in which they live. And Pushkin is growing up in the times of Alexander I, who is initially a liberal and then gets more and more reactionary. And then after 1825, we've got Nicholas I on the throne, and he becomes Tsar at the time of the Decembrist uprising, and there have been a lot of disappointed people who fought against Napoleon and thought that finally we were going to have reforms in Russia, and those hopes were dashed. And so it's a very repressive period, and that's when Pushkin's writing. And the superfluous man is someone who's got heroic potential. So Onegin's got potential to be this amazing person, and yet he cannot really fulfill his potential because there is no possibility for that. You know, people aren't free in Russia in Nicholas I's time, and that's why they're such drastic duellers and gamblers, because that's the only area of life where they can sort of operate some sort of free will. And yes, if you're thinking there are some parallels with today, I mean, you know, to go to a really strange extreme, you could say that, you know, someone like Alexei Navalny is a kind of superfluous man. I mean, he's been put away in prison, but Russians in the time of Nicholas I couldn't play a part in their political life because of the way in which their country was governed. You know, there was no parliament or anything. So that is what the superfluous man is. And Onegin has a big influence, all the male heroes of Russian novels all the way through the 19th century, going right down to sort of Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment, and, you know, Fathers and Sons with Turgenev. So it's a very important concept.
That said, it's quite difficult to feel sympathy for him. I often feel, I mean, isn't one of the reasons that he's superfluous that he actually has literally nothing to do? Everything is kind of done for him. I felt a scintilla of warmth towards him this morning when I noticed a passage in which Pushkin describes that one of the first things that he does upon inheriting his uncle's estate is to actually set up payment for the serfs, so they are no longer working for free, and this, of course, is one of the aspects that so irritates the society, such as it is, around in Tatiana's name day. But I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. What I'd really like is some context. How different was the Russia of Tchaikovsky's period to the Russia of Pushkin's period?
So there's a big transition if we're thinking about when the novel was written and when the opera was written, which was in the late 1870s. A lot has gone on. And I think a nice way of summoning up the difference of sort of tonality, if you like, is to think of, the era of Jane Austen, and then moving forward to maybe the era of the Bronte sisters or even George Eliot. Tchaikovsky's writing his opera at a time of the Russian realist novel. I mean, Anna Karenina is finished in 1878, and he is dealing with these heroes from a different age and writing them about them in a quite different way. So this is a big change from the sort of very ironic way in which Pushkin treats his characters, rather like Jane Austen's attitude, I think.
Tchaikovsky himself said that he intended the opera to be genuinely emotional, that it would be driven by sentiment, that it would not have pretensions. I mean, there's a theory that one of the inspirations, unlikely as it may sound, is the fact that he'd heard Carmen in Paris in 1876, I think, so the year after that was premiered, and the year before he began writing Onegin. Lada, to us now, it is so much a core part of the repertoire. Does it feel revolutionary within his own work?
I would say so, because the synopsis and the plot of it, in a way, we don't have a usual very, very dramatic ending. I mean, nobody really dies, and the entire thing, other than the estate, is set inside. We have it's lyrical scenes, what it was originally called, not even a plot of a libretto taken from a novel. So it was revolutionary in the sense that Tchaikovsky himself was convinced that it's not going to have a wider success in the big open world because of this lack of very dramatic moment or pomp and circumstance. But I think so yeah, in that sense I would agree with you that it was a very novel concept.
And if I could, pick up on
yes,
that. So Tchaikovsky is also writing his opera at the time of the grand operas like Aida, early 1870s, and he's deliberately turning against that tradition. And it is very radical. I do like to think of Tchaikovsky as a sort of revolutionary. In a way, you can see him as a kind of Chekhov of opera. So Chekhov was a dramatist who was a revolutionary by putting sort of ordinary life on the stage. And that hadn't really happened in opera before. No one was doing it really in opera anywhere. And the Russians, of course, come to opera much later than in the rest of Europe. Opera only arrived in the 18th century, and of course it was, dominated by Italian maestro di cappella for most of the 18th century, and then they didn't have a conservatoire for the training of professional composers. Tchaikovsky is one of the first graduates of the St. Petersburg Conservatoire, and so when they come to opera, they are already having to sort of deal with a tradition that's, long been developing in the West. And they do something different with it. And so the other great opera that's being written in the 1870s, of course, is Boris Godunov by Mussorgsky, which is also profoundly different. And so Tchaikovsky knew, too, that writing an opera that's set on a Russian country estate with these young people, I mean, we were talking about the superfluous, they're very young, these people. And Onegin, he's this sort of rather affected youth, isn't he? He's sort of interested in street cred more than anything else, and it's a very male concept too. But he really didn't want his opera to be staged by the imperial theatres either, because the imperial theatres was run by the Tsar personally, and it was a huge sort of bureaucratic institution, and the singers were sort of quite hard and long in the tooth, and they didn't really know how to act. And Tchaikovsky was very deliberate that he wanted to have young singers and young musicians performing, and it was performed by conservatoire students, in fact, when it was first performed in Moscow. And he was completely right about the quotation you began with, that it was going to sort of find its way to popularity, or rather roundabout route. So the fact that people put it on in sort of amateur dramatic societies, first of all, that meant it sort of took off quite slowly, and eventually it got round to the imperial family and the Romanovs, and Alexander III loved it and decided that it had to be staged. And so by that point, Tchaikovsky had to agree, and finally it was brought to St. Petersburg. But he was very conscious of not having a chorus that was going to behave like a herd of sheep on the stage. He wanted it to be natural, like a realist novel.
I'm going to ask both of you, actually, a question that you may well not know the answer to. It's just listening to you just there, it occurred to me about that 5-year gap between the Moscow premiere and it really becoming a success in St. Petersburg in 1884. Was this through publication? Were there adaptations published for domestic performance?
Yes, there was a clavier, wasn't there? There was a sort of...
It was always done, wasn't it, when he composed a new opera, and of course Countess von Meck had the privilege of his sponsor to have the first go and read of most of those. And yes, it was absolutely that you would do a reduction like the one I'm playing from, not the full score, so people at home could have a go and
these were hugely popular in the 19th century, weren't they? And an incredibly important way of essentially publicising a work, before
yes, it was
recordings.
Like a radio for us, or a recording. And of course, most people of those circles knew how to play. That was the entertainment. That was what Tatiana and Olga are doing at the beginning. They're accompanying themselves, and that was the way to familiarize yourself with the new work. The most popular one, a very important.
Also, you have to also remember there was a huge sea change in Russians' relationship to their own culture in the 1870s and early 1880s. So Alexander III is on the throne from 1881. And unlike all his predecessors, he was a Tsar who absolutely loved Russian culture and wasn't interested in foreign culture anymore. And so suddenly there was this sort of huge passion for Russian things. So an opera about Russian country life suddenly seemed, something that was going to be really rather popular. So that wouldn't have been the case earlier on. So that
presumably less politically provocative for the fact that it's not got anything to say about Tsars or anything like that. It's contained.
Well, the only sort of danger really was dealing with Pushkin, because Pushkin is Russia's greatest writer. He's their Shakespeare, and Russians always say Pushkin это наше всё. Pushkin is our everything. So it was quite an undertaking to try and write an opera based on this masterpiece by Pushkin. And a lot of purists felt that Tchaikovsky had ruined it because he made it rather sort of melodramatic and things, and he'd taken all that sort of lightness out of it. But no politics as such.
Do you think melodramatic is fair? Because, I mean, I was thinking about, I don't know when October was published. It sounds like it's around about the same period.
Yeah.
It seems to me to be very reminiscent of his vocal writing, of his symphonic writing. You always have something's moving upwards from the bass, something's moving downwards from the treble. Very, very lyrical. I certainly don't think of it as melodramatic. Do you?
Well, I would not name it that, but I will play you one moment, and tell me if you think it's melodramatic.
Okay, all right, we're going to have a vote.
And I tell you then what it is, or maybe you even know yourself, because so far we've been nice and gentle.
Mm-hmm.
Back to Tchaikovsky here. To his more thing you mentioned. But this certainly, I think, yes, we could say it's melodramatic, and on the piano I can't completely, give you the feel of the fate, which I think is crucial for Tchaikovsky.
The original
fate.
ending was quite
Yes.
melodramatic. I don't know if you want to talk about that now or later on. But
I think
This is, just to say what it is, this is the opening of a scene which introduces the duel later. This is before Beautiful Lenski's aria.
Coulda.
Yes, that's right.
I think, but before we get there, we should just quickly lay out the characters. You've spoken very beautifully with the Pushkin's description of Tanya as being this embodiment of the Russian soul. We've spoken about Onegin as the superfluous man. We've touched on Madame Irina, the widow, and the nurse who was married at the age of 13, I think. What of Olga?
What an interesting character.
Tatiana's little sister?
A happy creature. Меня ребенком все зовут. Everybody calls me a child, and she loves it. Sunshine, always missing a real company. Who is there? Only her sister to play with. And what does the sister do? She reads books from morning till evening. And for temperamental little butterfly, Olga, I'm fascinated with her aria. How many times she came to her sister, took the book out of her hands and said, "Oh, you always dream." And yet she never gives up. She does it again and again and again, probably done it since they were little girls. I mean, the point which always strikes me when I reread the novel is that when Lenski is killed in the duel, is it a year or less she gets married to some officer or somebody?
A cavalry officer.
Yes, so Olga goes and lives. Who comes and visits Lenski's grave before she moves to St. Petersburg? Tatiana comes to Lenski's grave. I think interesting small moments.
Well, Pushkin's a little bit sort of disrespectful towards Olga. I mean, she's a bit of a cipher in the novel, isn't she?
Well, she's
compared
even
to
more of a
Tatiana.
cipher in the opera because we just lose her completely after the duel.
Yeah.
But I find another little moment, sorry to interrupt, is in the quartet when they meet for the first time, the four of them, Lenski and Olga, and Onegin as a new arrival. And Onegin and Lenski are talking about the ladies. He says, "Which one is Olga?" "Oh, that one." "Which one is Tatiana?" Onegin asks straight away. And Lenski describes this as a heroine from a poem. And he says, "Oh, how can you be in love with the other one?" And he says, "What's wrong with Olga?" He says, "She has a round face, red, like that silly moon in the silly sky." And Lenski just brushes it off. I think in small little things, maybe we can see how Tchaikovsky also, because he couldn't reproduce the entire novel, but how he saw his characters, how they interact. That Lenski would dismiss, in a way, a very offensive comment about his fiancée, but then goes and challenges Onegin to duel not shortly afterwards.
But Lenski is a wonderful example of a character who, in Pushkin, is almost entirely parodic. You know, he's very, very self-critical here too. You know, he's the archetypal romantic poet, and in the Tchaikovsky opera, he's pretty serious as a character, isn't he?
Yeah, and also his famous aria, Что день грядущий мне готовит? Well, we all cry at the end. But actually in the novel, Pushkin says, and so the young poet sat there with curling hair, writing the useless strophe after strophe. So that's exactly what you mentioned. He sends it up, always, Pushkin.
This is what I want to know. Is Lenski, who is actually basically a gentleman farmer, is he a decent poet? Or is he actually a bit rubbish? Is he just an amateur? I mean, all we know about him is he's a liberal, he's an idealist, but...
I think he writes cliches.
Right.
He went to Germany, studying in Magdeburg and spent...
Like all the Russian young men did.
And got inspired by all the German romantic poets, and so he puts Olga totally on pedestal. I'm not sure how much he really loves her as a person, rather than the ideal he created of her, which I think is more likely.
I'm going to start throwing some well-directed spanners into the works now, because we were hoping that Julia Borbach, who will be directing Onegin, could be here tonight. Sadly, she's detained in Germany, not in the sense of by the police. She is working with a designer on another project. It's one of the casualties of the knock-on effects of postponements and rescheduling after the last couple of years. We had an interesting conversation about Onegin last week, so I'm going to feed some of her thoughts in as we go along. Here's one from Julia. There is never a real love story that is too banal. The reality is much more complicated. She is in love with an idea of Onegin, and Onegin at last is in love with an idea of Tatiana.
It's a very profound thought, that, actually, really, if you think about it, because it's true, not just of Pushkin's Yevgeny Onegin, but of so many great works of literature, but particularly this work, because Tatiana, she's got her head in books, and it reminds me actually of Romeo and Juliet. Isn't Juliet sort of in love with the idea of love, one of those characters? And so she's someone who just dreams the whole time. I mean, she's reading all these books and she's got this whole idea. And Onegin is this chap who comes along, and he's the first person to sort of jump into the shoes of this this romantic ideal that she's projected in her mind, and she's quite sanguine about it later on. And and Onegin too, he's this Byronic figure who's got an idea of what it is. And the novel is also sort of quite Tchaikovsky, that that girl falls in love with boy and nothing happens, and then boy falls in love with girl and nothing happens, and it's a bit of a sort of dead end, isn't it? And that's very like a Tchaikovsky modern story. So there is this whole question of what love is, isn't there? And it's thrown up both in the novel and in the opera, I think.
Does that correspond with what the score tells us? There's another interesting point that Julia made. She's almost certainly spoken to you about this as the two of you prepare for the summer. It's not a love story, but it is about romance. It's about longing and loneliness. Onegin and Tatiana are both loners. They're mirror images of each other. Neither one fits in.
So there is the bit I'm going to improvise, not because it will take ages. So that's the bit of Tatiana's letter scene. What does Onegin sing once he's seen her at the ball? Quotes the letter. So I totally agree that there is a mirroring, and Tchaikovsky must have been either consciously or unconsciously aware of it, because this is the quotation is complete. It's musical and it's also literal. So yes, has he already seen something in Tatiana and never admitted to himself he's seen her as a little girl? Because, as I said in the quartet, the first thing he says, which one is the Tatiana? He's not interested in Olga. So I would agree that there is a mirroring, and I mean, Julia also mentioned, didn't she, that he only hones on to Tatiana because he envies what Griemin has now.
Yeah,
it's been validated by a man of such stature choosing her as his wife.
Thankfully, Julia's not quite that cynical, but yes, I mean, she or at least that's how I read what she said. I'd never thought about Griemin in these terms before, but she said that he is so happy in himself, he is so at peace in his society, unlike the rest of the guests at what is, you know, the second excruciating social gathering that Onegin undergoes in the opera. He actually reaches out to his old friend, introduces him to his new wife, and sings about, you know, his great happiness. So he becomes the kind of man that actually Onegin would desperately want to be. Onegin cannot have the simplicity that Lenski has, and he has also effectively destroyed himself and his reputation by killing the man who would have been married to Olga,
and his
best friend.
His best friend,
yeah,
probably the only genuine, kind-hearted, naive, perhaps romantic, but not a bad bone in the body of that. What was he, 17?
And yes. That's also unconventional, because the only sort of real tragedy happens right in the middle of the opera, not at the end. I mean, it ought to be conventionally right at the end, shouldn't it? Yeah.
Okay, but if we look at this in terms of a context of other operas in you know, which are based on you know, great works of drama or poetry. I mean, we've got Falstaff, we've got Macbeth, Othello. From Verdi. Carmen, I'm not sure that you'd call Mérimée a great work. La Bohème, again, it's quite disposable literature. La Traviata, which I was again hearing echoes of in October, which is those falling figures. Yeah,
the sobs.
The sobbing, piangi.
An opening of a second act, isn't it?
Yes.
Or the last act of Traviata, you're right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Spooky. Where does Onegin sit within that sort of pantheon? I mean, I would say you could probably argue it's about the most successful distillation of a pre-existing work of art into, excuse me, another work of art.
If I look ahead, after Tchaikovsky, there is one which stands out for me, which is Janáček's Janúfa.
Of course.
If we move, I mean, so in that sense, if we don't look back but we look forward, obviously Janáček must have known Onegin, of course, but then probably enabled him as well to some extent to then take it even further. It was interesting when you spoke about the realism and not wanting it to be pompous and gods killing each other, or Aida entombed in a pyramid, you know, something which we can all relate to. Then Janáček then takes it even further.
Not just Janúfa, but Katja Kabanova. House from the Dead.
Yes, you're right. And the Cunninghams, and you know, so just maybe it's a side point, but there is also what comes after and what every composer enables the next one to do or open the doors.
I'll see you, Janáček, and I'll raise you Peter Grimes, because that's an intolerable poem.
As well.
Yes,
really
true.
Great
True. We've got so wildly sidetracked. I wanted to ask you, Lada, about the dances, about how the rustic dances compare to the sort of aristocratic dances in St. Petersburg.
It's an interesting progression, because we get a little snapshot of the dances of all those classes. At the beginning, when the peasants bring harvest, they have this lovely peasant dance, and with all the slightly naughty undertones that we can read between the lines, because harvest also, the summertime, there was always, you know, and the little hints, if you wish to rhythm. It's wild, it's boisterous, and it's very earthy, and Olga, of course, connects to it and quotes it in her aria. Second act, we have a Larina's ball in the house, which is the military band, and the officers are there, and it's quite provincial, and it's not sophisticated, and we have mazurka and ekoses. So these are the landowners and their daughters, and everybody's perhaps a matchmaking, and it's all very, very, kind-hearted and simple. There are no pretenses. It's just entertainment because nothing ever happens. And then we elevate ourselves to St. Petersburg with the grand Polonaise opening and the mirror halls and the marble and what have you. And then what also Griemin says in the second part of his aria, he sees those people, he sees what's behind the polish and the betrayals, the polite executions, the gossip, the spoiled children, but Tatiana shines like a star. So we have a really beautiful cut and show of each different dance societies.
Rosamund, would you like to talk about the ending that nearly was but wasn't?
And can I mention Alexandra Panayeva's name?
Please do. Yeah.
So, in the dark days of 2020, when the production didn't happen, we had a conversation, didn't we, Anna, about, did I have anything that I could perhaps write for the website? And it so happens that I'm writing a history of the Russian avant-garde at the moment, history of Russian modernism, and I was looking at Diaghilev's early career, and Diaghilev's stepmother's sister, Alexandra Panayeva, played a very important role in this opera, and I'm going to try and summarise it in as succinct way as I can. And I kept wanting to sort of do a little bit more research into this woman, Alexandra Panayeva, who was this very, very beautiful singer. And I thought, well, no, I must get on with my book. And then Anna said, have you got anything? And I thought, oh, great, I can't resist. And so I ended up writing this story, and it got so interesting that I ended up writing 10,000 words, and you got a little bit taken aback because it was just, going to be a short article. And the article's still there on the website if you'd like to read it. It's called Tchaikovsky's True Tatiana. So she was this very beautiful woman who looked like Tatiana, and in fact her family nickname was Tatusha, and she had many, many male admirers, including Tchaikovsky's brother Anatoly. And it's quite interesting to look into the sort of hinterland of this opera, because it's all about unrequited love. And you might remember that when Tchaikovsky was writing the opera, he was just going through his own disastrous marriage with a student who was in love with him, and of course he wasn't in love with her, and he was in love with the character of Tatiana. And this young St. Petersburg soprano, Alexandra Panayeva, had just been to study with Viardot in Paris, and she was desperate to meet Tchaikovsky. So she was in love with his songs. She was buying them. And Tchaikovsky was actually very shy, and he kept running away from her. And eventually they got to meet, after many false starts, at the premiere at the Mali Theatre in Moscow in 1879. And Anton Rubinstein, who'd founded the St. Petersburg Conservatoire, was astounded that Panayeva had never met Tchaikovsky, because he said, "You're such a propagandistka of his music, you're such a champion of his music." And so he sort of tried to get this ruse going, whereas Tchaikovsky would come to the box, and he came along, and he tripped on the door and almost fell into her lap. And Anton Rubinstein said, "Yes, that's where you should be, at her feet." And Tchaikovsky was so embarrassed that he ran away again, and she thought, "Oh, my hopes are dashed again." And the very next week, though, Anatoly, his brother, arranged for there to be a luncheon at St. Petersburg, and Tchaikovsky, after the premiere, came to St. Petersburg, and they finally got to meet. And it was very strange, because Tchaikovsky insisted that Anatoly and his other twin brother, Modest, sit on either side. And she wasn't allowed to address any questions to him directly. And then she was allowed to sing for him, and she wasn't allowed to approach the piano. And Tchaikovsky insisted that his brother sat on the piano stool as well. But the minute she opened her voice and started singing, he fell in love with her voice, and indeed wrote wonderful songs for her. And Anatoly Tchaikovsky, of course, was still desperately in love, and she didn't really return his feelings. And eventually he had to give her an ultimatum, and her parents, really dissuaded her. And so Anatoly went off to Moscow. He thought, I better just, create a new life for myself. And now I'm getting to the end of the opera. So the original ending of the opera, you've got really quite a melodramatic ending, and it's still available in the early printings. And the first edition, you've got Tatiana saying, "Oh God, send me strength in my agonizing struggle. I like his confessions, and his entreaties are sweet to hear. His desperate call pierces my heart deeply, madly suppressing my sense of duty, and draws me to the abyss. Eugene, have mercy on me, I beg you." And she says, "What am I to do? What is happening to me? I'm dying." And then her husband comes in, and she utters a shriek, and the prince says, you must leave now, and that's how it ends. So she's sort of about to succumb. And the whole interesting thing is that when Anatoly arrived in Moscow, it was just months before the unveiling of the first statue to Pushkin in the whole of Russia. It wasn't in St. Petersburg, because Pushkin had died in a duel, and duels were against the law. And the statue was put up through public subscription, and that was a hugely important thing for Russian culture, that they'd got this statue where you can see it today in the middle of Moscow. And they had a big party when it was unveiled in June 1880, and Turgenev was dying in Paris, and he came for it, and Dostoevsky was dying in St. Petersburg. It was the end of his life, and he came and gave a long speech. The only one who didn't come was Tolstoy, and that's another story, because he didn't want to be not at the centre of attention for people. But the Dostoevsky speech was all about Tatiana being the symbol of moral virtue, and being the embodiment of the Russian soul, and being noble, because she had said to Onegin, "No, I might still love you, but I've committed to be married to someone else, and I'm going to stay true to him." And so Anatoly thought, "Oh my goodness, we can't have the first professional production of this opera with that rather melodramatic ending now, where Tatiana's almost sort of giving in to Onegin at the end." And he writes to his brother and says, "Come on, you've got to change it, Petya." And so Tchaikovsky sees the wisdom, because they have the first professional production in the Bolshoi in Moscow in 1881. That's before the Petersburg one. And so that's when he changes the words of the ending, so that we have Tatiana saying, "Farewell, you've got to go now. I'm going to be staying true to my husband." And it sort of all ends rather feebly, and then Onegin just has to go off with his tail between his legs. So that is quite a major change, actually.
Yeah, it really is a major change, and it also gives her a kind of agency, which is extremely unusual for the time. She dismisses him.
Yeah.
Lada, are there, if you had to give a sort of point by point things to listen out to in the highly unlikely event of anybody being here having never heard Onegin before, what would you pick? What would be your sort of?
I would say, if I can. Okay, just a couple of quick things. Just a couple of portraits of people we have. In the opening, the theme of Tatiana comes straight away. So this. Just this undulating. Then I would say, since we spoke about it, a little vaudeville from the Larina and the Nanny. Then a beautiful moment is the letter scene, of course. For Olga's character, we have a tiny little thing, and then her aria. That's her placid and happy character. Peasant dance. We will definitely recognize. I'll try to speed it up. What you really open your ears when you come in. It's the moment before Tatiana speaks to Nanny and writes the letter scene. That music is so Tchaikovsky. The torture of her heart. Then, as theme of Nanny, very Russian folky. But this is as Nanny as it gets. So that is her mini portrait. And to this, and when she speaks about getting married at age of 13, I love the way Tchaikovsky portrays the church. Yes, so and finally she says, "Father put me to a blessing," and we have the service music from the church. You can hear the liturgy being sung. I would like to give you also a little superfluous portrait of Onegin just before he comes and rejects her. For me, this is him, totally. So elegant. So charming. How can you resist?
There's something supercilious there.
Yes.
Yeah.
You can just see him
Seeing a frilly cuff.
taking his gloves off to look at the letter again. Then he goes into attack. You've written to me. Don't deny it. And then the torture starts for poor Olga. And of course for Lenski, and just to play the iconic start of his aria. And then, so you will hear that. And probably the last thing, a bit of Grevin. So I would say those are our points, our characters, our things to listen to. I'm not trying to play the ending, whatever version it is. No.
It's too harrowing. So Grayman at least is happy, as long as he doesn't know about the meeting between his wife and
It's funny, a
Onegin.
lot of the people who sort of complained that it was sacrilege for Tchaikovsky to adapt this sacred work and make it into an opera actually forgot that actually Gremin doesn't actually exist in the Pushkin. I mean, the husband does, but Tchaikovsky gives him the name, and so they actually.
He's referred to as Fat General.
Yes, exactly. And which I find always funny. And then he's looking at her, the fat general in the corner, and that was Tanya's fate. And that's all he says.
But the opera, I think, became even more popular than the novel. In the years running up to the revolution, it was by far the most popular work, and there was a fabulous Moscow singer called Leonid Sobanov who'd come in and star in the Mariinsky productions, and every young singer was dying to have the role of Tatiana, so it really did become the most beloved work, and even after the revolution it actually continued to be very popular.
It was positively promoted, wasn't it? I mean, it was part of the idea of raising everyone to the elite through culture, at least for a while. We should wrap up very shortly. I just wanted to sort of throw out one last question, which is something that also came up last Friday when we were talking about Carmen. what is it that you think we do when we return to a classic work like this time and time again? Lada, can you take this first? I'm also interested in Rosamund's perspective.
I think every piece, such as Onegin, reflects some part of our humanity, and we connect to it. And each of us here can, through that music, come in touch into some parts of our soul, our being, our history, who we are, and recognize something which we all have in common, whether it's now, 100 years ago, something which we all can connect to and make us reflect on our times where we are here and now. And so that's I would think when we come back to them, is to hear our story or part of it and recognize the emotional, historical, human things we all share. When you come to it back as a musician, which I hope I will have many times be able to do, it's finding each time it's endless. You can live 3 lives, 4 lives, 100 lives. Within 2 bars of that piece, I will always find something new. I will always find something interesting to relate. And then if you do it, perform it for different people in different companies, again, it reflects whoever is here with us today. So that's what we do. We carry on the fire. We carry on the torch of it, so we can all come together, share it together, and reflect, and be hopefully uplifted in that knowledge of our shared humanity.
Or at least elegantly undone.
Yes, yeah.
Rosamund, what about you?
I don't think I could come up with a response as beautiful as that, actually, but this is an opera that, has a lot to do with literature and reading, and as someone who comes from a literary background primarily, I think there's a sort of parallel you can draw with reading a novel, isn't there? Because every time you come to read a novel, it's different because you're different. Things have gone on in your life, and I can relate to that. Having translated Anna Karenina, I've read it many times, obviously now, and my understanding of the novel changed even during the process of translation between my drafts, and so there's an endless potential for coming back to these great works. There's a universality of content, isn't there, that we can relate to. It's extraordinary that the themes are just as relevant and topical to us now as they were when Tchaikovsky was writing the opera and when Pushkin was writing his novel, and so it's an endless potential for enrichment.
Okay. Are there any questions from the floor? Because I know that we have some lovely white and red wine waiting for us downstairs. Anybody care to ask Lada or Rosamund anything? No. I'll take that as a vote of satisfaction. And I will just say a huge thank you to Bob and Elizabeth for hosting us, and to Rosamund and Lada for a really wonderful, really insightful evening. On April the 20th, we're going to be at the Italian Cultural Institute talking about this summer's double bill of Margot LaRouche and Le Villi, with James Savage Hanford, Paul Guinery, Merera Pugh Davies, Martin Lloyd Evans and Francesco Ciluffo. Onegin opens the season at Opera Holland Park on May 31st, conducted by Lada and with Anush Hovhannissian in the role of Tatiana. The Tchaikovsky biographer, Philip Ross Bullock, will be joining us for a pre-performance talk on June 3rd. If you haven't had enough about talking about Onegin, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Rosamund. Thank you, Lada. Night.
Thank you, Anna.